Great. Thank you, Alyssa. And it's great to be back with you all this morning. Again, my name is Stephanie Ertis. I'm CASA's Associate Director. I have a co-presenter with me this morning, so I want to pause here for them to introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Claire Niggle, and I am a former SALI Legal Advocate. And I'm so excited to be here to present with you all.
Great. Thanks, Claire. It's always such a pleasure for me to present with Claire. We've been presenting this presentation a few times, so it's great to have her back with us to talk about money matters and the economic empowerment of survivors. So we're going to kind of jump right in here this morning. We have a lot of content to cover. I want to remind everyone again that we're going to try to be as interactive as possible. And we know that we are not the only people that have information about this. So we are going to learn together today about empowering survivors when it comes to their finances and it comes to money. Because we don't hold all the knowledge in this space, we want to review our learning objectives with you. There are important things to keep in mind as we consider our time together and preparing to share knowledge on this topic. So we're going to start by describing the economic costs of sexual assault for survivors. At the end of this presentation, you'll understand the role societal and institutional inequality play in a survivor's financial situation. You'll understand financial abuse and the tactics abusers use to impact a survivor's financial security. Claire's gonna talk about developing strategies for discussing money with clients and developing strategies for cultivating financial stability and safety for clients facing economic challenges. So just to review our outline, we're going to talk about the economic impact. We're going to talk about talking to survivors about money. We're going to give you a little bit more information on the Sexual Assault Legal Institute and what they can do to help when it comes to survivors and finances. And then questions and closing. We'll have some time for that at the end. So let's jump right into the economic impact of sexual assault survivors. But before we do, I want to talk about the fact that this topic may be new to you. If you have been doing advocacy for a while, this may not be something that you've discussed before. And if you are brand new to this topic, then you likely have not heard about this economic impact. So you may have some strong emotional reactions, or the content could be triggering to you. If you are a survivor advocate, you might become angry or frustrated or upset by some of the statistics that we're going to share. So we encourage you to take care of yourself during those moments. And if you have to step away, know that the slides and the recording will be available to you to watch at your own pace as well. So let's start off with some poll questions, and I'm going to see if these are in here. So yeah, okay, here we go. So let me back up. I missed the first one. Okay, so here's the first poll question I have for you. Thanks for bearing with me a little bit. So how often is money a barrier for a survivor you are working with? So if you want to take a minute to answer that question, how often when you are working with survivors does money stop them from doing something that they would want to do? Is it every individual, most individuals, every so often it comes up as a barrier? It might never be a barrier, or you might not know. You might not be talking to the survivors you're working with about money, and that's okay too. That's why we're here, and we're going to learn about how to do that today. So if folks want to answer this, it looks like most people are saying most individuals they work with have some kind of financial barrier. And there are a couple folks where it's coming up every single time, like every single survivor they're working with is talking about money. So here are the results of that poll for folks. I want to bring up another one here as well. So if money is, well, and you know what, I'm actually going to skip this one. So this was if money is not a barrier, why? But it seems like for this group, money is mostly a barrier for survivors. So we know that this is money and finances is a barrier for survivors seeking services, but let's talk about what those actual costs are to survivors. So many people do not know how much of a barrier money can pose to a survivor of sexual assault. When someone chooses to commit sexual violence, that doesn't just leave physical and emotional wounds. It can affect every aspect of a survivor's life, including their financial stability. So research has shown that the financial cost of being a sexual assault survivor is incredibly high. So the statistics on the screen are from CDC research, and it found that someone surviving rape or attempted rape has an estimated loss of $122,461 over their lifetime. For someone who survives childhood sexual abuse, this cost could be almost $300,000. Nationally, economic costs include costs related to healthcare, mental health care, productivity loss, and the impact on higher education and childcare and other incidental costs. These costs add up for our society as a whole as well. If you combine all victims of sexual assault in the United States, the lifetime cost for our society, for like the United States, for our country, is $3.1 trillion of lost productivity, criminal justice intervention, and healthcare. And the breakdown of that is on the screen. So what this is the cost, this $3.1 trillion is the cost of all of us, the cost to all of us for someone committing sexual assault. So this research was conducted by mathematicians that the CDC contracted. They got them to come together on this project, and they helped finance them doing this actual mathematics statistical equation to find this out. So this was conducted in 2016, which is about 8 years ago. So these costs are likely a little bit higher from 8 years ago. So when we're thinking about this, we need to think about this in a sense that like this could be, up to $150,000 or more, $300,000 or more for child sexual abuse. So I want you to think about what we could as a country do with 3.1 extra trillion dollars. So think about for just a second, if you were in charge of the country, what you would spend $3.1 trillion on. For me, I'd probably spend it on education. Imagine how that would impact our country if we were spending an additional $3 trillion on education. And imagine for an individual what $100,000 to $300,000 of more money into their life would make. This is community changing and life changing money we're talking about when we're talking about the impact that this has on sexual assault survivors. So let's talk about where the costs to survivors come from. Like, what is this $100,000? What is this $150,000 or $300,000? So I divided this into a couple of categories that are on the screen, and we're going to start with work. So sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace, or someone that has been sexually assaulted outside the workplace, but is still dealing with the aftermath, the trauma, and healing of that, can have long-term economic impact on survivors, the majority of whom are in their prime earning years, or they're assaulted right before their prime earning years, where they should be laying the foundation for their future jobs or careers. A sexual assault may cause them to disengage from their jobs. They may quit their job or leave their field entirely. When women leave a job because of sexual harassment or assault or retaliation for reporting those things, it's often for a lower level position or a job they're probably overqualified for, and likely one that pays less. So many leave quickly in order to feel safe because they before they have a well-paying job lined up. Now, this research was conducted on women leaving their positions, but we know that men and non-binary people are also harassed and sexually assaulted at work or even outside of work. And so we can deduct that they may also leave for lower level or lower paying positions. So this could mean a loss of future work and promotion. It could be a loss in professional development. It could be a loss in any kind of advanced training or a delay in any kind of advanced training. So even if they don't leave the position, it could lead to all of these other things. It could lead to performance issues, missed opportunity, getting disciplined for missing work a lot or using all their sick days. So there's a combination of things that can happen related to someone's work. So regardless of what their profession or their job is, they could suffer this impact, and that could cause them to suffer financially. So when we look at the education section, some of this is similar, where in the work section, we saw people losing jobs, using extra sick time, or, their personal leave. In education, that looks more like skip classes or withdrawing from a course. It may mean dropping out of school or transferring schools. For folks that are in college or some kind of training program after high school, it could mean an incomplete degree or taking a much longer time to complete that degree. It could be transferring schools and losing some credits. And it can have a negative impact on educational goals. One of the things I always like to point out when we're talking about the education loss is that if a student drops out of college, this is kind of specific to something that they would take out loans for. So if they've taken out loans to attend college and they drop out, they still have to pay those student loans back without completing their degree and moving on in that career. So that can have a huge financial impact for survivors. So let's move on to the health column. So if our mental health is impacted because of a sexual assault, or our physical health will be impacted too. So there may be physical injuries or physical impact to the sexual assault, but if there's not, and there's mental health impact, it can also show up in many other physical ways. So victims of interpersonal violence and interpersonal sexual assault are at the highest risk for health problems, including, pelvic pain and issues, sexually transmitted infections, gastrointestinal problems, chronic pain, autoimmune disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder. These health consequences often continue long after the abuse has ended. So healthcare costs for those experiencing abuse were 42% higher than the cost of women that were not abused. Women who are abused 5 or more years prior to the survey were still facing costs at least 19% higher than those that were not abused. And once again, this study was conducted on women. So we can also deduce that for men and non-binary folks, that they will also have higher health costs, and they will also see physical health repercussions from their assault. So I also want to say, as more and more research is done on other types of victims besides women, we'll probably have more insight into that impact. So that's something that we want to advocate for. So let's move on to access and other incidental costs. So this is kind of all thrown in together. So there's some intangible experiences that expenses that someone might suffer: pain and suffering, psychological distress, decreased quality of life. One of the access issues is childcare. So paying for childcare so that someone can go to therapy, or they can go to group counseling, or they can go to all the many meetings involved in a judicial process. That cost can add up. They can have additional housing costs because they want to live someplace safe that may cost more than they were paying before. They may end up with a poor tenant history if they leave an apartment or break a lease quickly. I do want to add here a little caveat. Survivors of sexual assault can break a lease with no penalty, but they would have to seek out that help. They may not know that, and they may just leave, and now they have a poor tenant history or a poor record for renting. There could be transportation costs for getting to appointments or court appearances, and there might be costs associated with going to court if they're involved in that process. Some of those costs may be reimbursed, but not always. And sometimes that reimbursement takes a long time for a survivor, so they have to put those costs up front. So other things that may impact a survivor's financial stability are debt. It's expensive to have debt. You're paying interest over and over again. So whether that's credit card debt or other debt, that can impact a survivor. Moving expenses can impact a survivor. They may have to handle property damage from their abuser. One of the things when I did in-person advocacy, when I did advocacy work with survivors, one of the expenses that seems small but could really impact someone is if the assault took place in their apartment or their house, sometimes the police would confiscate bedding or clothing or rugs or other things that had evidence on them, and they would never see that again. So now they have the expense of buying new sheets or a new comforter or a new coat or a new pair of shoes. And those expenses can really add up for a survivor, especially if they're not expecting them. They may also have some things associated with the legal process, as I talked about. Now, many times those legal expenses are free, but again, sometimes they're fronting that money, or they're working with an organization that can provide that. So one of the things that we like to do in our presentations as much as possible is have you hear from the survivors. I'm gonna take 1 minute here, turn up my volume. So to hear from survivors that are impacted by this. So this is a video, it's a short video that describes the economic impact that these survivors felt as a result of their assault. You may have to turn up your volume on your computer a little bit, so feel free to do that if you're having a hard time hearing it.
It actually was hard to actually just get a job. It's hard to, go out there and sell yourself and say, I'm a great, I'm a great hard worker, because people will be like, well, haven't you been working for 2 years? And then, you can't actually say, well, that's because I was raped in 2008.
There was also about a 3-year period when I just felt absolutely exhausted. I found it very difficult to get out of bed. I found it very difficult to get on with my life. And I didn't want often to be out in the world.
So my career took a complete left turn, or right turn, I'm not sure. But my turn, let's start that over again. My career took a complete turn as a result of the rape. I mean, prior to that, I was actually a film producer, and I'd been working, pretty busy, active life for a small film production company, and it was exciting stuff. We were shortlisted for the Oscars. I went to the Oscars. The post-traumatic stress disorder, the anxiety, the depression. The complete lack of energy I had after the assaults totally robbed me of my ability to work as effectively. So I had to leave my job.
The amount of brain space that getting out of bed in the morning, getting clothes on, doing the day-to-day of life suddenly became completely impossible.
It was actually years before I was able to work again. I wasn't able to go back to the previous job. I wasn't able to find a job afterwards.
I ended up quitting without having anywhere to go in terms of a job. And just, it was just very difficult to deal with those things at the same time. I was trying to phone various people, organisations like Women's Aid and Rape Crisis, sort of because I didn't want to do that at home, because I was still with my ex. I'd be doing that sort of like in meetings room, trying to be as quiet as possible. I'd be going to the toilets and crying and that kind of thing, and trying to hide it.
I call that year my zombie year, because I was pretty much a zombie.
And of course this had an effect on my career. When once I'd been very energetic and very driven, I found it much harder to get the kind of energy that I needed to go forward and to make work.
It's not just that you're crying all the time. You're crying all the time because you don't have a career, and because you literally feel like you're devoid of your own personality as a result of the assault. And it affects the way you trust people in your relationships, and because your career is affected, it affects your finances, which can then have a massive impact, 5-10 years later, because you can't buy property.
At the moment, we're seeing a way of talking about mental health in the workplace where it's starting to become allowed to be able to talk about depression, but coming out and disclosing to your employer that you've been the victim of a sexual trauma is still full of taboo and stigmatized. And the number of women who have told me that they have lost their jobs as a result of disclosing it's just mind-boggling, and it's not right.
So let's talk about financial abuse. So not only does the cost of healing services and justice services rack up for survivors, and you heard a little bit of that impact on people's job in the last video, but they may also be victims of financial abuse from the person that's also sexually assaulting them. And they might have even less access to money or economic stability than another survivor that's not living with or partnered with their abuse, with the person that perpetrated the sexual assault against them. So financial and economic abuse occurs when the abuser controls the survivor's access to shared or individual assets. So you heard that one woman in the red shirt talk about how she was trying to make phone calls at work because she was still with the person that sexually assaulted her. She was still living with that person. So in those situations, that person may be exercising some financial abuse over the survivor. So it's one of the most powerful methods for keeping a survivor trapped in an abusive relationship. And it deeply diminishes the survivor's ability to stay safe after leaving a situation of abuse. So research indicates that financial abuse occurs in 99% of domestic violence cases. Interpersonal sexual violence is very common in domestic violence. 75% of women in domestic violence shelters reported experiencing at least one act of interpersonal violence during the past year. So this intersection of interpersonal sexual violence, domestic violence, and financial abuse are all coming together in this slide. So financial or economic abuse can take many forms. So these are some of the categories that you can see financial abuse in. So employee-related abuse is when an abuser prevents a survivor from earning money. There can be many, many ways that they do this. They might prevent them from attending a job. They might demand that they quit their job. They might prevent the survivor from looking for jobs or attending job interviews, so causing the survivor to lose their job by physically hurting them or abusing them before important meetings or interviews. They may harass the survivor at work, sabotaging work or employment opportunities by stalking or harassing them in the workplace. And they may forbid the survivor from attending job trainings or advancement opportunities, like a conference or something they may have to travel for. Coerced debt is another category where an abuser forces non-consensual credit-related transactions. So that's kind of a big way of saying that they could be applying for credit cards, obtaining loans, or opening an account in the survivor's name. The survivor may or may not know that. They may be stealing their identity to do that, or they may be forcing the survivor to sign paperwork where they are going to incur a bunch of debt. They may force the survivor to sign financial documents that the survivor doesn't understand or doesn't know a lot about. They may use threats or physical force to convince the survivor to make credit-related transactions. They may refinance a home or a car without letting the survivor know that. They may demand that their joint assets, like a car or like a home, are just in the abuser's name. Or they could force the survivor to turn over public benefits or threaten to turn the survivor in for cheating or misusing them. They might even file false insurance claims. So there's lots of ways that coerced debt could be a part of an abusive relationship. I want to say too, one of the things that I saw that was really interesting when I did work is amongst students, I would see abuse occurring with like assets that that were specific to the university. So meal plans or memberships to things like the university athletic center or tickets to events. I would see abusers use students' IDs to gain access to those things where they weren't supposed to. Now, sure, if someone's boyfriend or girlfriend or dating partner wasn't part of the campus community and didn't have their own ID, maybe they'd try to sneak them into those things. But I also saw that being abused as well, where the student did not want to get in trouble, did not want to abuse that, and they were feeling like they were obligated. So depending on the survivor you're working with, this financial abuse could be nuanced. So think about that when you're thinking about talking to them about their finances, their money, and their empowerment around securing money and finances and resources for themselves. So access to information and other needs is also a part of financial abuse. So preventing them from accessing information. So doing things like hiding records or changing passwords, not including the survivor on investment or banking decisions, withholding funds from the survivor or children to obtain basic needs such as food or medicine, hiding assets, refusing to pay or evading child support or bills that you think that they're being paid. All of those things are considered financial abuse. And some other forms of financial abuse that are just kind of in this other category could be stealing the person's identity, which we talked about in that first category, forcing the survivor to work for a family business without pay, refusing to work or contribute to the family income, withholding money or giving the person an allowance, or demanding that a lease or mortgage, oh, I already talked about this one, demanding a lease or mortgage of assets is just in the abuser's name. I would say that using checkbooks, ATM cards, credit cards without that person's knowledge is also a way that they can abuse someone's finances. So I want to ask a quick chat question here. So some of you have worked with survivors, and some of you may just be thinking about your experience working with survivors. But as an advocate, what are some examples of financial abuse that you have seen survivors experience? So I'm going to move on to the next slide, but I'm going to come back to this poll question. So put in the chat what of financial abuse you have observed when you're working with survivors. Make sure you're not revealing any of their information, but just talking in general terms. So as we wrap up this section of the training, we want to end with this very important topic of inequity that contributes to economic disparities for underserved populations. BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color, people with disabilities, the LGBTQ community, those that are immigrants, and others that experience oppression in our society face greater financial hardships. The prevalence of sexual assault increases dramatically as annual household income decreases. So survivors with marginalized identities often fall through the cracks when seeking support services, or they don't seek them at all. Underserved populations already experience barriers to economic attainment without adding the extra layer of survivorship. So on the screen, you'll see several barriers that underserved populations encounter when they're trying to get jobs or own property or get promoted. These are things like the wage gap affecting women and especially women of color, mass incarceration or gentrification, redlining, which is the denial of various services or goods like loans and mortgages by federal governments, local governments, or the private sector that directly or through selective raising of prices deny people of color access to housing, the school to prison pipeline, LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness at higher rates, harassment for LGBTQ people in school and workplaces, and environmental displacement of people. So toxic air or water or natural disasters are already economic burdens that disproportionately impact people of color. So people from underserved populations experience many barriers to economic security in the first place while simultaneously being more at risk for being victims of sexual violence in their lifetime. All of these layers of trauma, violence, oppression intersect with economic insecurity. This is why this training is so important, to continue exploring new ways to serve survivors who are experiencing injustice and stress from so many different places, including their financial situation. So I'm going to back up to the poll question and look at some of your answers about what you have seen. So Megan put not allowing survivors to be on the rental lease. Absolutely. That's a pretty common one. Changing jobs so that the victim won't be getting a continuously monthly child support payment. Oh, that's sneaky. Thanks for putting that up there, Antonio. I'm seeing some other things about leases and utilities being in their name, getting an allowance and controlling where they work and the hours they can work. Abusers delaying or prolonging civil court cases, making the survivor responsible for growing legal fees. That, Maggie, thanks for putting that in there. That's definitely one that we see. Not paying the mortgage or providing financial assistance for any housing bills. Absolutely, that can be one. Not allowing the survivor to work or not allowing them to have their own bank account. This is a big one. So thanks for putting that in there, Alexis. Really controlling what money they can touch, like physically touch. Taking money from the college fund that might be set up for children. Absolutely, that's a way to do that. So these are great answers. So continue to, changing contact numbers. Oh, that's a good one, Kelly. So absolutely, these are all examples of how someone can control the finances of someone that they are abusing. And this is going to lead us in. I have one more slide to exit out of my part of the presentation that I want to read to you because I think it's really powerful. But these examples that you just gave are going to lead us right into Claire's part of the presentation where she's going to do some skill building around really talking to people about money and talking to survivors about money. But I want to end my section with this quote from the California Coalition, now called Valor US, from their 2017 guide on an intersectional approach to ending sexual violence. And this really talks about the economic justice of our movement. So the economic burden for survivors of sexual assault is real. Women at the margins are the ones who bear the brunt of the harshest realities, including sexual violence, and they do so with the least resources. The most vulnerable communities facing poverty and economic hardship, as well as sexual violence, are dealing with the compounding and layering of burdens that impact basic needs. Their ability to feed, clothe, and shelter themselves and their families. Services need to provide the comprehensive and flexible support that these survivors need. So since this, in 2017, we have seen more resources becoming available for survivors, and I'm optimistic that those resources for survivors that are flexible and appropriate and address this economic stability will continue to grow. So with that, I want to turn it over to Claire to give you some skill building around this topic. So Claire, it's to you.
Thank you so much. So next we are going to discuss kind of starting the conversation about economic safety, advocacy, and independence. Before we explore some of the steps within that conversation and different methods for navigating those steps, I just wanted to acknowledge that similar to many other aspects of our work, these conversations are not one size fits all. In order to have a conversation that's worthwhile for our clients and truly provides supportive guidance and builds on their strength, we have to acknowledge what sort of things may impact their current financial state and what they may be looking for from us. So this includes recognizing that there are a wide range of circumstances, and Steph mentioned some of these, but needs and goals may differ between individuals, and it's important to acknowledge that just because we perceive something as urgent does not mean that it is a priority for that survivor. So considering their safety is integral to effective advocacy in all regards and remains integral in ensuring effective economic advocacy as well. So we just want to remember that Each client may react differently to the conversation and may need something different from you as their advocate. So, to kind of show how this can play out in real life situations, I wanted to present 3 different client scenarios and ask that you all consider how the needs and priorities of each client may differ from one another, just as I kind of walk through different details. So, first we have client 1. They have no concerns about economic safety planning and do not wish to discuss any assistance relating to their financial state. They find it insulting that we would initiate this conversation and are adamant that they are completely comfortable financially and do not want or need our help in that area. Next, we have client 2. Client 2 identifies their experience as economic abuse. They explain that they've been forced to sign financial documents without understanding what they were, and their abusive partner has control of all of their earned wages from the last 2 years. They have shared assets, but they're not sure if their name's included on any of those assets, and they have children in common. They're not interested in pursuing anything involving criminal law, but are interested in exploring options to increase economic and physical safety, as well as family law options. Finally, client 3, they have just physically left the home shared with an abusive party. They have poor or no credit and are trying to begin saving money, but they're unsure where to start. They do not use the terms economic or financial abuse to label their experience, but would like to discuss options to assess their current financial state. They would like to discuss family law options that might be available to them. And their current employment options are limited due to their immigration status. They're particularly unsure how to navigate risks after the abusive party previously threatened to use their immigration status against them. For me, envisioning client scenarios presents a tangible way to display how wide of a variety of circumstances we may be presented with when exploring economic safety. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. As always, we want to be prepared to handle these and any other situations in an appropriate, client-focused, and trauma-informed way. So even if we think we have the answer for a client, we need to remember that our job is to restore this person's agency over their own life and empower them to voice their needs and their wants, and simply provide our knowledge and skills to assist them in reaching the goals and priorities that they have set. All right, so the first step in this conversation is just a general initial screening. So to begin the screening stage, you can start just by collecting information. Now, I want to note, not all screening questions will look the same across different agencies. So as we continue to explore the stages of this conversation, you will notice that I will outline some logistics about what to consider within your current intake process or client conversations. I find it can be helpful to consider these things before you're in a conversation with clients, but it will likely be an ongoing learning experience, which is, of course, okay. In addition to being present during conversations with clients, try to be mindful about what feels right and natural versus what may be feeling rushed or forced, so that you can kind of make adjustments moving forward to refine how these practices take place within your specific role. As an advocate, it's also important to know why you're asking these questions. So consider how this is relevant to your work. How can you use this information and work with this client to increase their safety or work to alleviate concerns? And where does this appropriately fit into your current intake process? And just generally keep in mind that there are a lot of reasons why someone may feel uncomfortable talking about their finances. So putting in the effort to make this conversation feel as natural and seamless as possible can have a significant impact. Some suggestions I have are structuring this conversation to center around the survivor. At this stage, the main goal that we have is to understand their current financial situation, their concerns, their priorities in addressing those concerns, and anything else that they want us to know. It can be difficult to not let our own perspective of what needs to be addressed here influence the questions that we're asking. But just because something stands out to us does not mean that that's a priority to the survivor. Some examples of how we can conduct this initial screening is incorporating open-ended questions, just kind of allowing survivors to choose what they share with us, and make sure to center questions around the current impact of the situation on the client and clarifying their goals and priorities when we discuss that further. Some specific questions that we can ask here are things like, how is your financial situation impacting your safety? What are your biggest worries regarding money? Do you have any concerns about your financial situation impacting your access to things like safe housing, stable income, or employment at the moment? And just other questions kind of gauging what that current situation is and how that's impacting them right now. All right. Oh, I think we skipped 2 slides. Thank you. The next one, sorry. Thank you so much. So the next step is continuing the conversation. So this means going beyond that initial information gathering. This is another stage where it can be important to logistically assess where this conversation fits in with your interactions with clients. So considering if this needs to be separate from an initial intake, considering if there are urgent questions that you want to ask during the initial intake and explore further later on, and just generally finding what makes the most sense in the context of your organization in particular. The goal of this stage is generally just to build context. So we're aiming to build an understanding of where this client is coming from, what factors might impact their outlook, what risks, strengths, and skills we should be considering, and what existing values the client might have that may impact their perspective on finances. All of these things provide critical insight to this client's values when it comes to money and how their personal experiences impact where they might feel comfortable or uncomfortable moving forward. These also give us an understanding of how people have helped and harmed this person using their finances. And we can use that information to be mindful and build some protective factors if that's what the client is looking for. Some examples of questions that we can ask in this stage is, what is important to you when it comes to money and why? Just generally tell me more about your financial situation. What did you learn about money growing up, and how does that impact how you manage money now? When have you experienced financial hardship in the past? What have you done? And asking about what worked and if they would try that again. What are your strengths when it comes to money? And who has hurt you in terms of your financial situation? Who has helped you, and how have they done that? This information matters because it provides context that allows us to address economic safety in a way that aligns with the client's values. It gives us a broader understanding of where this client is and how we can use their particular strengths and skills and previous methods to guide safety planning and strategies. For this section, I think it's particularly helpful to kind of review what information we already have about their situation and what would be helpful to know moving forward, so that we're taking everything into consideration and considering the information that the survivor has offered us already before we're asking them to share more. All right, so before we move on to an outline of how we can move forward with the information gathered from survivors, I just want to take a moment to check in with you all, just to see if there's any questions that you might have about how to approach starting that conversation. If you have any concerns about how and where this may logistically fit into your intake process, or just any thoughts or ideas you wanted to share with the group. So please feel free to post things in the chat or raise your hand or come off mute. And I'm always happy to answer any questions that come up. And I'll give you all just a moment before we move on to the next section. If you don't have questions, that's also completely okay. All right, well, I will keep an eye on the chat just in case anything comes up. Next, we will be exploring some practices associated with financial or economic safety planning. But before we jump into the specifics of safety planning, I just wanted to take a second to kind of revisit the basic definition of safety planning for a moment. I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with what safety planning is, but the important things for me to note about the definition of safety planning is that it's individualized, it's developed in partnership, and it addresses the unique needs and circumstances of individual survivors. And just as a reminder, we can't guarantee safety in any scenario, and often we're collaborating with survivors on safety plans because that person is in an inherently unsafe environment. However, the goal of this conversation is always to get to a point that they are becoming more safe. And in economic safety planning, these goals and principles remain the same. We're just centering economic safety in that conversation. And this can, of course, also be developed as a facet of a more general overarching safety plan, if that's something that your organization already has a process where that would fit in nicely. So the goal in economic safety planning is fairly simple. We're working towards becoming economically safer by offering knowledge and tools to support a survivor's ability to work towards their own safety, prioritize the concerns and precautions most critical to them, and we're restoring that survivor's sense of agency and control over their financial independence. For those goals to be achieved, an economic safety plan should address a wide range of safety needs for the survivor, work to reduce economic risks based on their values, goals, priorities, and strengths, and also just focus on increasing a survivor's self-determination with regards to their finances. Right, so before we can actually create a safety plan with a client, we need to understand the risks that they're experiencing or the risks that generally apply to their situation. So it's helpful for me to discuss what risks you can identify from the information that they've provided so far, and then clarify what feels accurate or inaccurate to the survivor. So those can be risks associated with the abusive party themselves, whether those are physical, psychological, sexual, economic, whether they involve access to medical care, property, children, if there are threats to the safety of children or to the survivor. And then also considering general life risks. So things like experiencing a variety of isms or living in poverty or mental health challenges that the survivor may be facing, obstacles relating to employment or experiences with substance abuse, and education level. Addressing these risks and addressing which of these feel the most important and which feel most present in their situation, just give us an idea of what needs to be considered as we navigate what options might be available to increase safety. And we also want to address fears and priorities that the client might have. And it can be helpful to just kind of have a natural conversation about what scares or intimidates them about this process. Can we alleviate that fear in any way while also maintaining their safety? And is there something that maybe we're proposing that is not a safe option for this person? Here, we just want to make sure that their priorities are clear, and we can always confirm that what we understand still feels accurate to the survivor. Regardless of where we are in this process, this can and should be an ongoing conversation. And then we also just want to identify what resources are available to the survivor, whether those are specific to economic resources, whether they apply to housing, whether they're just general community resources that can be accessed, and then also what resources are available within the survivor themselves. So things like what skills we've discussed, how we can use those skills to increase safety, what are their strengths? How can we use those to build resources? What options have already been ruled out in your conversation? And then just a few examples of personal and community resources. Personal resources can be things like skills that might create opportunity for either formal or informal sources of income, strengths that might help build resources. And then any methods used previously by the survivor that worked well. And then community resources can just be things like storage, housing, support, partnerships, things like that. All right. And then, so one note that I wanted to make before we moved on to steps in safety planning that take action towards safety and security is that even though in theory these are all steps intended to increase safety, they are not always safe. The safety of each option needs to be assessed on an individual basis during the conversation of risks and safety, and then continuously discussed throughout the development and execution of a client safety plan. And at the end of the day, if the client does not feel like it is safe, then it's not safe. We cannot make that determination for them, and we need to be able to work within the safety of their situation and adapt to their specific needs. Right, so we're going to discuss steps towards safety within a few different categories, but the first I wanted to address is just surrounding bank accounts. So we should be creating an individualized safety plan regarding financial safety and security. So for bank accounts, this may mean things like closing joint bank accounts shared with an abusive party, securing existing bank accounts by changing passwords and PIN numbers, changing passwords on cellular devices, computers, or other accounts, being sure to review how to access accounts if the survivor may be locked out of them, and potentially creating new bank accounts if that's something that feels necessary. And then we also want to be sure to address financial safety as it relates to financial documents as well. So if possible, ideally, financial documents would be gathered and put in a safe place. So we want to consider if an abusive party is in possession of these documents, can we assess with the survivor whether or not it's safe to gather those documents or make copies? If the client is able to collect those documents, make sure we're collaborating on a safe location for them to be stored. So for this, also noting that a safe location may not only mean safe from the abusive party, but also should take into consideration it being a generally safe place for financial information to be stored, if that's at all possible. And then if there are any missing documents, this can be a good place to offer tools and information on how to replace those missing documents. And then another thing that is important to focus on is savings. So if access to financial resources is a concern, we want to start discussing potential ways that a client might be able to start saving money. So this can begin by just discussing what ways the survivor might be able to start saving even the smallest amount in a safe place. And then also navigating the risks and safety aspects associated with that. And this can mean revisiting some of the concerns that the survivor may have mentioned in earlier discussions and addressing any specific areas of concern that may have come up previously. And this will look different based on the abusive party's level of access to the client and other risks that apply to their individual circumstances. So this can be a great place to get creative with the client and take advantage of some of their strengths and skills that you also explored previously. And then also here, it's important to find a safe place to store savings, whether that's a bank, a friend, a family member, just a generally secure location, whatever makes the most sense and feels comfortable for the survivor, just kind of exploring what that might look like. And then also, if it's appropriate, developing a plan if there's a risk that the savings may be discovered by the abusive party. Another crucial aspect of financial safety planning is addressing the survivor's cost of living and just general basic needs. So as advocates, we can help create a cost of living plan that the client can stick to kind of help them meet their basic needs and navigate what their expenses look like. And here it's important to create a plan that is realistic and meets the true needs of the client. Everyone's priorities and needs look different, and this budget or plan is really only helpful if you're able to have an honest conversation to ensure that all of their needs are being considered. It's also important to note if they live with an abusive party, it may be helpful if they're interested in making two budgets, to make one for expenses while living with the abusive party and one for living independently. That way, if circumstances do change, they still have access to a financial plan. And this is also another place where it is incredibly helpful to kind of loop back to what resources this person might have access to and which resources they feel safe and comfortable using. So these can be things like considering or providing information for community resources and considering how they may be helpful in meeting some of the client's needs, potentially without additional expense. And then also considering safe relationships, whether that's friends or family, that may be able to provide additional assistance or support, and discussing whether or not that's something that the client might be comfortable with. And then lastly, it is important to discuss any additional precautions that may be relevant to the client's situation. So we want to explore these options and kind of determine what relevant additional steps may make the most sense based on the client's needs. And these can include things like opening a line of credit to use in emergencies, reviewing, assessing, and monitoring credit reports for suspicious activity, discussing the risks associated with credit checks through landlords, banking institutions, if you're taking out loans, things like that, disputing coerced or unknown charges and accounts, and disputing identity theft charges or accounts, For identity theft, I did want to note that that can require reporting to law enforcement or the IRS. So that's also an important thing to discuss with the client. And then additionally, sometimes these conversations include the client wanting to speak to an attorney who can explore potential legal remedies to economic safety or other concerns. And those can include options like protective orders, divorce, custody or criminal proceedings, immigration proceedings, and different employment options. Here, I did want to just mention the Sexual Assault Legal Institute, or SALI. We'll, of course, also include SALI's information at the end of this presentation as well. But if you don't have attorneys in office with your organization, I just wanted to note that it can be valuable to consider fostering a relationship with other legal organizations in the community similar to SALI, so that there can be an opportunity for warm handoffs to explore those legal options if a client decides that they are interested in doing so. And also, just generally, if there is something that you can't come to a solution on how to address or mitigate, collaborating with other advocates and attorneys, whether that's within your organization or that means reaching out to other community organizations, it can be helpful to bounce ideas off of other advocates that are doing this work and get their input to see what solutions you all can come up with. And then also, I just wanted to note here, have an ongoing conversation with the client to make sure that they're feeling like their safety plan is still relevant and still working for them. That way they don't have any additional needs or need any support making alterations or discussing, how this may need to adapt with the changes in their situation. And that's already being built into check-ins. All right, so similar to our check-in for information gathering, before we move on to more of a group conversation, I just wanted to take a moment to check in with you all. Are there any questions or concerns that you all have regarding building an economic safety plan or discussing the options for working towards economic safety with clients? And also, if anyone has any thoughts or ideas that came up during our exploration of steps towards economic safety, please feel free to share those as well if you're interested. Okay, well, if anything comes up, like I said, please feel welcome to post in the chat, and we can always address that later on as well. All right, so to initiate the process of collaborating with one another and learning from the advocates working alongside us, we want to wrap up this section of our presentation by kind of asking you all a few questions just related to your experiences working to build economic empowerment for survivors. So for these questions, please feel welcome to post in the chat or raise your hand if that's a function that is available to you all. And we can get some input from different advocates, hopefully. So our first question is, how have you begun the conversation surrounding financial needs? And how have you used that to create a plan of action with survivors that you may be working with? And if that's not something that you've done, please also feel welcome to share any ideas you may have about how you may start beginning that conversation with survivors you're working with. Now, obviously, this can also involve a lot of different situations, whether that's pertaining to how you all are interacting with clients and what, if any, convenient opportunities exist to initiate this conversation. I know for me, the way that this conversation is initiated with survivors really depends on the situation that's being presented during the intake and how that conversation is being guided by that survivor in particular. Sometimes it feels, most appropriate to really address that when we're gathering initial intake information, and sometimes it makes more sense once we're discussing more details about the situation, or a client might mention something that sparks a point of concern and we explore that further. Steph, do you have any input on this question that you wanted to share?
While people are putting some stuff in the chat, I can just tell you, I don't know, an urban legend from the field. So I did not work with this client, but I knew advocates that did. She came into shelter. She was in her late 60s, and she had decided after 40 some years to leave her abusive husband. She had never worked outside the home. So worked, obviously, but had never held a job outside the home. And so the advocates were really concerned about her financial situation. They had assumed that her husband, her abusive husband, had full and complete control over their money, their whole marriage. So they put off this conversation for a long time. And it was getting to the point where she was going to need to move on to a more sustainable housing situation and not be in the domestic violence shelter. And so they asked her, leading up to that her time where she would need to move on. They weren't kicking her out. They were just like, okay, we need to move to the next step. If she had concerns about money, and she just would answer no. She would just be like, no, I have money. They had no idea how much, and so she was really tight-lipped about it. And so finally they were like, we really are concerned about your financial stability. Let's talk about that. And she finally said, well, the day before I left my husband to come here, I went to our bank account and took exactly 50% out of all of their finances and put it in her own bank account. So she had already done some of these things that Claire had talked about. And so I think it's just and so she had like $250,000 or something that was like boggling to them, right? And so she really wasn't worried about money. She was due that money. She felt she was due that money. She took the actions to secure it before she left her situation. So I think that example illustrates a couple of different things. Survivors know their situation. They are the ones in control. They have resources and talents and information that we don't. So, my very anxious advocate friends, rightfully so, were like, we're really worried about this woman. But we didn't need to be. She knew how to take care of herself. And so we are there to be, kind of guides and resources, but they're really making the decisions. And I think that also demonstrates some bias that we might have towards someone coming in who didn't hold a job outside the home, or wasn't getting a paycheck, but still was working, still understood their financial situation. So I think the nuance of these conversations is really, really important, as Claire demonstrated. So that's just a story I like to share. It's got a really positive kind of outcome. But I know, Claire, people were probably putting stuff in the chat, so I was just kind of buying some time while folks did that.
No, thank you for sharing that. That is a good example. And I think that speaks to, really throughout all of our advocacy efforts, but also when discussing economic safety. At the end of the day, the survivor is the expert. And while obviously we can always check in and say, hey, we really are concerned about this aspect, and we want to be sure that if you are too, that we're offering tools to help you navigate those things. But yeah, absolutely. Trusting the fact that they know their situation best is always important. So I just want to address, I saw that we saw a few messages in the chat. Monica said, one way is checking in about supports in general, leading to finances in an organic way as appropriate. Absolutely. And I think that's a great way to make that conversation feel natural and less targeted. I think that can be helpful in transparency and comfortability when discussing something that can be difficult for a lot of people. Kelly said offering information about churches, resources, support groups, and different programs. Absolutely. We refer clients to different financial resources within the community, including social services. I ask what kind of supports they're comfortable using, social services, religious organizations, family and friends, etc., to help guide the plan. Absolutely. Those are all great responses. I think recognizing, what is appropriate to explore within your organization and what at the end of the day would be, most valuable to explore with potentially another resource is always helpful. If we don't have the tools to explore that within our agencies, then giving the client the tools necessary to access other community resources is always valuable. And I think all of those approaches in kind of exploring what supports they're comfortable with and then offering the tools associated with those supports can be really helpful.
I
Antonia
really
said,
like this.
sorry,
I
go
was
ahead.
I was just gonna add on to that, Claire. I really like this aspect of working with clients around financial stability. Sometimes you can just tell them what partnerships you have. Like we have a partnership and a lot of our clients go to this specific Goodwill. I worked with an agency that the Goodwill there gave everything for free to the people at the shelter. So instead of saying, do you need clothes, saying, hey, we have a partnership. If you want to go down there, let us know. They have great stuff. Kind of like when you start a new job, all the benefits of the job, listing some of the benefits of working with your organization can lower some of those barriers. Someone doesn't have to say, I'm worried about winter coats for my kids. You've already said, we have a partnership with this organization that does backpacks and stuff for kids. So if you want, let me know if you want to hear about that. Or, we have a partnership with some financial institutions about savings accounts. I think sometimes that talking about the benefits can really lower that threshold and really make it feel comfortable for people to take advantage of some of those opportunities if they're a little hesitant. So that's been my experience that I would offer here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a great point. I think also it can help it with the openness of that conversation because I think presenting things as, hey, here's the information. If you're interested, we can take advantage of that. And if not, we don't need to explore it further. I think also can lessen the feeling of having to go out of your way to ask or request assistance with services, which when it comes to basic needs and financial support can be really difficult for a lot of people. And like you said, I think just offering that information up front and offering that to all of the survivors that you're working with can also reduce the impact, like you mentioned earlier, about the assumptions that we can make as advocates and sometimes incorrectly make as advocates. That way, the information is there for anyone who may need it. And there's no question of, oh, I didn't think that they needed this resource, so I didn't offer it. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point. And then Antonio mentioned what work experience or trades do they have, help them navigate workforce services in the area. Absolutely. That's a great way to start kind of exploring those personal resources that we talked about. Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, I will move on to our next question. Thank you all so much for providing your input. All right, so our next question is, what resources have you used or organizations have you referred a survivor to in Maryland that were helpful and effective? Obviously, there are a lot of different resources, and there are always new resources that we can learn about as advocates. I see Megan mentioned Maryland Legal Aid, Women's Law Center. Amazing. Legal Aid. I know something that was helpful for me. I participated in an economic justice cohort with advocates from different organizations across the country. And we talked about even like online information resources or websites with good links or helpful tools. While we always want to have as much knowledge as possible about community partnerships that we could be building and positive experiences that survivors are having in the community. Also, just sharing information about links that we can offer to survivors to explore, different safety plan options or different budget plan options or banking options or financial literacy resources, things like that can also be extremely valuable.
Claire, I also like to always bring up when we do this slide, Maryland 211. You can call them. If you are not familiar with Maryland 211, it is set up as like a regional call center. So when you call them, you're talking to people that are experts on the resources in your region. So if you're working with a client and they really need that kind of specialized local resource, they'll be able to find it. I think this is incredibly useful if someone's asking you something you have no idea about. Like if someone's like, oh, I need, and it's really specialized, and you're like, oh, wow, I have no idea. Try Maryland 211. Their website is 211md.org, or you can call 211 and let them know what region you're in. And they can really assist you. They also have access to all the local rape crisis centers if that's something that someone hasn't been connected with yet. And you can literally kind of type in your need and it'll give you those list of resources. So that's a good general place to kind of seek out some resources you might not be familiar or connected with.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. And I think too, something that can be helpful is even if you just have something come up in a conversation where you're like, I actually am not familiar with any resources that would be able to address that if this was a concern for that survivor. Even just exploring that to have as a kind of resource bank as an advocate to start kind of learning about what's available in your region before a survivor may even need it, I found was valuable just to kind of explore that in my time when possible. That way I could think, when a client mentions a unique situation, be like, oh, actually, I remember a random organization mentioning that on one of their service listings or something like that. Thank you, Alyssa, for providing that link to 211. And then I see domestic violence directories. Absolutely, that can be helpful. Community action agencies.
That's why she passed by and say hi. Oh.
Okay. And again, please feel free to continue sharing in the chat if you all have any other resources that you wanted to mention. And like I said, continue to reach out to other organizations, even if it's just a matter of connecting with other advocates. I know I had some connections with advocates in different organizations where even if it wasn't something that fell under their scope of services, at times I would reach out and be like, hey, I have a situation that's really stumping me. Obviously not sharing any client information, but reaching out and saying, are you familiar with anyone who's doing this type of work? Or are you familiar with anywhere that we could potentially reach out to that offers these types of services? Taking advantage of learning from fellow advocates is something that I found extremely valuable. All right. And then this is just a slide. Steph beat me to it. You're one step ahead of me. No, don't apologize. Maryland 211 is an absolutely wonderful resource. Again, whether you're offering their information to survivors or using it yourself, like Steph mentioned, you can call or visit their website, and they have information about a wide array of community support resources for things like victim services, legal services, resources for folks experiencing homelessness, shelters and housing assistance, mental health providers, campus health centers. They have information on so much. So it can always be helpful to reach out to them if you do have something come up, or if you're just looking to become more familiar with different service providers in your community. All right. And then Obviously, there are a myriad of remedies to economic concerns, but particularly there are a myriad of financial legal remedies depending on the facts of the situation. So I just wanted to plug SALI's information and mention SALI advocates can help with financial safety planning, and SALI attorneys can offer legal consultations that will help identify any legal remedies that might be available to survivors of sexual violence. Some of the areas that SALI covers is criminal legal advocacy, whether those are things like requesting and receiving results of HIV and Hep C testing, safety concerns regarding setting release conditions, privacy matters, financial compensation through the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board claim, and different civil services for survivors through things like peace and protective orders, privacy matters, termination of leases, employment law, Title IX proceedings, immigration matters, family law, and then of course, safety planning. And we can also offer referrals for tort cases. So their phone number is there. And then I will pass it off to Steph just to talk a little bit about the Money Matters Lunch and Learn series from last year.
Great, thanks, Claire. So we want to end this presentation with some more resources. So if you are going to be working with survivors and in this context frequently, we recommend our Lunch and Learn series from 2023. So this is only a year old. This was conducted by one of our sexual assault staff attorneys, Sexual Assault Legal Institute staff attorneys. It was 4 sessions. Here are the topics. So if you're working with someone that may need resources around family law or personal property, housing, debt and credit restoration, or criminal law, all of these things really, all of these presentations are about 30 minutes long, and they really tell you how the law can help survivors access some sort of financial remedy or financial support. So I definitely recommend that. The links to those recordings will be offered in the email that Alyssa's going to send out after this presentation with our recording and with the PowerPoints. So they're going to be there for a while. There's no rush. But if you're worried about, or you're thinking about, or you're working with survivors in this context, we highly recommend that you take a look at some of these resources as well. So this brings us to the end of our presentation for Money Matters. So you've all made it through your first week. I know this is a lot of content, but one of the things I love about this presentation is, as someone that did direct service work for a decade, this really put into words what I was seeing survivors struggle with. I did not know at that time that $120,000 plus was going to be, kind of the financial burden that individual survivors were gonna have. But I was really seeing that in very anecdotal ways. So Claire and I will stick around if you have any questions. And I will see you again next week for your last workshop next Thursday. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa to close us out.
Thank you. So I have posted into the chat today's anonymous evaluation form. Again, we greatly appreciate all feedback as we're constantly striving to improve. Additionally, if you are seeking a certificate of attendance or a certificate for CEU credits, you must complete the evaluation form. Upon submitting the evaluation form, you'll see a box at the top of your webpage containing a link. And if you click on that link, you can access the certificate request form. As Stephanie mentioned, I'll be sending out a follow-up email later today with a copy of today's video recording, the PowerPoint slides, as well as the links to the Money Matters videos and today's evaluation. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me or respond to that email when I send it out later. And we hope to see you next week. Thank you.